So I'll talk about the philosophical foundations, but I do want to explore specifically the difference between structure and agency. I apologize if on your end, I apologize if the captions box is covering this. I will be uploading the slides for you so you have access to those as well. But with structure and agency, these two concepts are really key within sociology. The first is that structure is kind of the larger organization. It's called patterned arrangements in our society. So this has to do with like the relationships and interconnectedness, yes, between individuals, groups, and institutions, but the structure is the larger society essentially. It is governed by policy, laws, rules, and norms, and cultural values, belief systems, things like that, because sometimes they are not formal necessarily, but the structural makeup of our society has to do with patterned arrangements in our society. So, how is our society set up? It essentially is to help our society function as a whole. And an example would be some of the cultural and social norms. So, like raising hands in class, that is a type of social norm, lining up in line in the grocery store. And then there's, more formal types of norms like laws. So the idea is it's supposed to help us function in some society, like our society function as a whole. Within that structure, you may also hear systems, which is where you hear the phrase systemic, right? So systemic racism. And this idea of systems essentially is all of the different interrelated components that are connected. So like the processes and the interconnections and the relationships between those within the world and how they connect with those patterned arrangements. So the structure has to do more with larger society and the expectations of society. Agency and structure, though, have to be viewed together. And you may have heard the word agency before, because it's the idea is like, oh, you have agency, and we do. But agency, from a sociological perspective, structure and agency need to be considered as very closely interconnected concepts because your agency is impacted by the structure. Agency can either be empowered or disempowered by the structure. So agency is like an individual or group's ability to make decisions or choices. Um, and it has a lot to do with power and access to resources. It has a lot to do with, again, how is the structure set up? What are the laws and policies in place? And it can impact an individual's experience or ability to make some sort of choice or movement, or it does impact mobility oftentimes. So institutions can play roles as well. So institutions are an odd in between in that they have their own agency as institutions, but again, those are impacted by the structure, and how that works. How are they empowered or disempowered? And then also as individuals, we're navigating those institutional expectations to like marriage, um, government, military, all of those things. So when we're thinking about it sociologically, we have to understand how our agency is interconnected to structure. If the structure does not allow particular groups of people to live in certain neighborhoods, that means that their agency is limited by the structure, right? So, because we know that redlining is a very real historical fact that happened, which was where the government drew red lines around particular neighborhoods and green lines, and those neighborhoods with the red lines around them had to do with the fact that they were populated predominantly by people of color. That meant that their choices in schools and how the schools were going to be funded was limited. The agency or choices to make that, to the ability to make that choice was limited by the structure, how the laws and policies were in place. If the structure does not allow you to learn to read, your agency to make that choice is limited. Now, what happens a lot though is that in sociology, we kind of focus on this like despair and how depressing it is that the structure is limiting or empowering certain groups inequitably and understandably 100%. But it is important to note that just because the structure limits agency does not mean that individuals and groups of people do not have agency or power to make that change. These structures and institutions are human created. And because they're human created, we absolutely can and do oftentimes make the choice and have that agency to radically reinvent things or push things beyond the scope of what they have historically been. This dynamic between structure and agency is also helps explain why certain groups of people in positions of power may negatively impact other groups of people or disempower them intentionally, and why those groups of people who have been disempowered would understandably become frustrated and resist or push against or protest or um, respond and react in a way that wants to change the structure. So if the structure has been created to empower others and keep them in those positions of power, essentially, and disempower others to keep them seemingly powerless, then this is why the dynamic between those two is so important in society, in sociological analysis. It also means that this helps influence our understanding, or should help influence our understanding, that when we talk about certain things like systemic racism, we tend to be limited within the agency component, where we are only focused narrowly on our individual side. So when we talk about systemic racism, that's also oftentimes, or anything like systemic ableism, like all of these things, that's why it's important that we understand that as sociologists, we're not talking about individuals, like you individually in our class, making these choices. We're looking at the structure. We're looking at those in positions of power and the powerful dynamics in our structure. And that's essentially what we're analyzing. That doesn't mean individuals can't make choices to do terrible things, and that on an individual level, people aren't problematic and aren't upholding these things. They absolutely are. But what we're saying, what I'm saying here is that sociologically, what we're doing is we're looking at how the structure impacts and creates and paves the way for some individuals and others within that current structure on an agency level. Okay. So just to kind of quickly go down the idea of institutions, because you may hear institutional or institutions in any other sociology class or higher education or in this class even. Institutions exist within our systems or our structure. The idea is that it's parts of a whole. So our structure or system is the whole, and the institution are parts, right? So the idea is like you have different parts of a car that are all a part of the car that make the car itself is the car, but just because it's a motor or an engine, right? Or it's a gasket or it's a hose doesn't mean that those themselves make up the car. So the institutions are parts of a giant, of a larger system or a larger whole. Um, and how we are socialized oftentimes has a lot to do with our social positions, the institutional impact, and these institutions are created by humans as well. The intention of them is that they're supposed to fulfill some sort of role within our society. They are supposed to serve some sort of organizational function, so a way to organize all the different parts of our society. Because they're supposed to help us make sense of the world, right? Because the world can be wildly confusing. The world can be pretty, chaotic and confusing. And so the idea is that these institutions help us make sense of the world. There is an element of social control, and I don't necessarily mean that negatively, because the idea is it's supposed to help us coordinate things, right? It's supposed to help us coordinate the different elements of our lives in the whole. It also does, though, uphold systemic expectations. So a good example would be nonprofit organizations, for good or bad. They exist. They exist because of the structure of the world. So nonprofit organizations exist with the idea of them being charitable in theory and being for community or people, because the structure is not necessarily intentionally designed for that way as a whole. Also, thinking about nonprofit organizations as well, their ability to be engaged in certain activities is limited because of the systemic expectations. So again, some additional examples of institutions would include family, education, military, government, religion, right? The family unit. So that doesn't mean your individual family, but the idea of the family, of what the family is, that is considered an institution, because there are a lot of interconnectedness between the institution of families, our individual families, and the structure. So, for example, the idea of taxes, right? How we file our taxes is determined by how many people we have in our family. So there's all of these different interconnections together. Okay, so when it comes to research, because we are in a social statistics class, we're not running deep statistical analyses in a way that would be considered like quantitative research. But it does provide us the foundation to understand a quantitative research approach. And I'll get into those a little bit more, but essentially philosophical foundations really are the key to understanding, why we would conduct research the way that we would. We have two kind of main philosophical branches that I'm going to talk about. There's far more than this, but for the sake of our class, just kind of foundationally, I want to talk about these. There's one called ontology, and then the other is epistemology, and they work a lot very closely together when we're thinking about research. Ontology is essentially the philosophical foundation of asking, what do you believe in? Like, what is it you believe about the world? How do you see the world, and what do you believe about it? I like to say that there's kind of this idea that, do you believe in the singular truth, or a truth with a big T, or do you believe that there are multiple truths that can exist together? This does not mean multiple truths, for instance, does not mean that there are not historical or very real socio-political truths, like very real current facts is what I mean. Like there are actual facts that have happened. That's not what this is saying, that there is no fact. What this is asking is basically, do we understand that there may be multiple things going on, or do we believe that there's like one singular truth out there? In terms of research and the philosophical foundations, what this is asking is like, do you want to see the various things that can contribute to this, or do you really just want to find out one thing or one outcome? If you're trying to do the singular truth with a big T, the one single outcome, it's a singular focus. That philosophical belief is positivism. If you believe that there are multiple truths out there, right, that there are deeper explorations and deeper meanings, that's called constructivism. Whether or not your ontological belief, right, your ontological philosophy, so again, this idea of ontology, of what you believe, if your ontological belief is positivism or constructivism, that will determine what type of research method you go down. That's because of this idea of epistemology. Epistemology now kind of goes off of this idea of ontology. Ontology is asking, what do you believe about it? Epistemology is, how do you learn that? How do you learn more about what you believe? And this, again, really is the underpinnings of the research method itself. Because it's asking us how we learn what we know and believe, it's connected to positivism or constructivism. Epistemologically, now these are big words and I understand that, but I just want you to know where they come from. Epistemologically, within the field of epistemology, if your belief is a positivist ontology, that tends to be more of a quantitative approach. If your belief is more of a constructivist approach, that ends up being a qualitative research approach. These are important because the types of research questions that we ask determine which types of research method we use. Now, we're in a stats class, so we're only going to be dealing with this idea of quantitative approach, this quantitative reasoning, statistical analysis. But being able to differentiate between them is key when we're thinking about research, because this qualitative approach, which is more meaning making, absolutely is data. But again, for statistics, we're looking at it from a numerical standpoint. So quantitative and qualitative, the quantitative and qualitative are the two primary research method approaches. Quantitative has to do more with collecting and analyzing numerical data. This is where we would get our statistical analysis. You're going to describe things statistically. You're looking for patterns and relationships, predictions, and hypotheses. So you are creating an actual hypothesis. You're making some sort of prediction. You're doing some sort of predictive inferential statistical analysis like linear regressions, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And the goal of it is to be generalizable. So essentially, what that means is that the goal of that data is something that you could use that data and apply it to another demographic similar. The intention is that generalizability to make assumptions about other demographics. The idea is you take a sample to make explanations about more. This oftentimes is seen through surveys and outside secondary data sets. So you take a survey that's like multiple choice or numerical in answer and numerical in nature, it creates data sets. Qualitative research, on the other hand, is not numerical. It is looking for larger meaning making, but more in how things are created, the symbolism of it, how we make sense of the world. We're looking at the social phenomenon more from a lived experience perspective. So this is why interviews and observations, you can do like visual analysis, you can watch a bunch of movies, for instance, and you're looking at what messages are we receiving, um, how are social phenomenon explained this way. Qualitative is looking for like the detailed and rich meanings of human beings, the kind of the storytelling aspect of data from human beings. And this is why, focus groups, for instance, are a lot of like communications and marketing folks will use qualitative research through focus groups because we're looking for, the larger meanings behind things, while quantitative is looking at, you know, numerical analysis. And this is why quantitative is related to positivism and qualitative is related to constructivism, because this is how things are created, how things are socially constructed. There are different beliefs and patterns and truths out there, while quantitative is looking for really one or two singular outcomes out there with the data. Okay, so the last thought I want to leave you with this particular lecture is this idea of a sociological imagination. Once you're done watching this, you're going to follow the instructions, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail. The sociological imagination is a concept coined by C. Wright Mills in 1959. And just foundationally, he talks about it being a matter of private troubles or personal troubles versus social problems. Our private troubles are more individual circumstances, which those are very real. So things like maybe you have some sort of marital strain, you're having issues with finances at home, you're facing joblessness. C. Wright Mills recognizes that yes, it is absolutely an individual issue, but it may also be part of a larger social problem. So if it's something like joblessness, yes, it impacts the individual, but it may also be a larger issue because it's impacting the community. So how is it applied in a larger context? The sociological imagination allows us to, he says basically, it's where neither the life of an individual nor the history of a society can be understood without understanding both. And this idea of like it's where history meets biography, being able to find out how our individual selves are connected to the larger history and social conditions of the world is really important when we think about now analyzing the world around us and analyzing issues in our society. It's not enough to just think about only our individual struggle. Don't get me wrong, I'm not dismissing that, right? You absolutely deserve to be heard and articulate that, but then going beyond and realizing that perhaps this is a larger structural issue too. On an individual agency level, yes, it's a problem, but what is the structural conditions as well? So your next steps then will be to follow the instructions and go from there. Is used to explain patterns in our social phenomenon. It is to help us to understand what's going on. So I'm not going to go into much detail, but just remembering that theory and research, the scientific inquiry are very closely connected, right? Because theory is developed through the scientific method. And we're looking at the explanations of things on a group or collective level, and how these things may differ. Excuse me. Okay, so within theory, we have kind of macro level theories and micro theories. Macro theories are large scale, micro theories are smaller scale. So when I say micro theory level theory, though, it does not mean that it's like individual, like theories on explaining human behavior on an individual level, like why I behave a certain way. What I mean is it's it's to explain a smaller component of society. So there's three main theories in sociology: structural functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. So structural functionalism is probably structural functionalism is essentially the dominant lens in which we view the world. And when I say we, I mean on a larger system-wide structural level, societal level. Structural functionalism basically says that we have this social organization based off of functions of and needs in our different society. So essentially, if it exists, it has a function. If if prisons exist, they have a function. If schools exist, they have a function. So all of these different things have a function. If it exists, it has a function. Even if it causes harm, it still has a function. So, for example, a functionalist would say that poverty, because it exists, it has a function. Um, and the function from a structural functionalist perspective is to motivate people because you don't want to live in poverty. And so with that, structural functionalism is looking at the way that society functions. It looks at the larger consensus of society while putting the responsibility and blame on individuals, and oftentimes. So with that, we all individually and as groups have roles because there's some sort of logical arrangement in our society, right? So the idea of structure, within our structure, things are structured accordingly. We all have different roles that we need to fulfill, and those are kind of determined as a way to distribute labor. Where it gets funky is that if we aren't fulfilling these roles, that's what causes the dysfunction. Another thing about it, though, is that it also dismisses the way that structure may set up certain situations intentionally to continue to marginalize and minoritize individual people. But I'll get into that. So with structural functionalism, right, each part of society has a special function, and with that, we have to meet the needs. So Parsons specifically is looking at like the family being the primary institution, and that society really needs to meet the needs of the family. Um, in very, thinking about the context of the time, very heteronormative perspectives. But in this case, Parsons, says that the father has the instrumental tasks, like essentially the important ones, providing financial support and decision making. And those are the instrumental tasks in the family unit. And the mother has expressive tasks, so caring for children and providing emotional support. Society has to meet the needs of the family, so that way these roles, though, can continue to be upheld. So that way the instrumental tasks can be met by the father and the expressive tasks can be met by the mother. Everything kind of revolves around the family. Meanwhile, Durkheim talks about society needing equilibrium. There needs to be some sort of equilibrium so we can continue functioning. And that society does need to adjust, though, to make it stable. So, for example, and I say criminals into law-abiding citizens loosely, in the sense that we know that statistically speaking, the criminal justice system has unfairly targeted, folks of color. But in this way, from a structural functions perspective, society needs to make things, need to provide situations to adjust to make society more stable. So how do you reduce crime? You implement prisons. For Durkheim, it's really a big focus on equilibrium and a division of labor. The idea should be that we are constantly trying to make society stable. Now, with that, he also looks at assimilation, though, to some degree, and that we need to be assimilating so we have a shared beliefs and we have a consensus. One of the biggest struggles is that it kind of lacks a little bit of diversity. Durkheim does a lot of great work, and he, at the time, really was a big advocate for, humanization. So I'm not trying to say anything negative about Durkheim himself, but for him, it's really about equilibrium, harmony. So the idea is that we need to have some sort of sense of like norms and some sort of norms that we've all agreed upon. So if there aren't any norms or there are too many norms to adhere to, it can cause a sense of chaos or anomie. In that case, when there's a sense of anomie, there's no, well, he says there's no, like, we don't have a moral guidance as individuals. A really good modern example of anomie in our society is when COVID-19 hit and we were opening things back up, and it was a matter of wearing masks. Some groups' norms were to wear masks, some groups' norms were to not wear masks, some groups' norms were to wear masks in certain situations. It really depended, and that's caught, and from a Durkheim perspective, that caused a sense of anomie because there were too many norms across the different groups, and it caused a sense of anomie, a sense of chaos. And that's where from this perspective, that's where some of those struggles came from. And then foundationally, structural functionalism also relies heavily on this idea of meritocracy. It's this perception that we can climb the ladder and do really well if we have, skill and hard work. Those who are the best of the best are the brightest. Those who are the top with the most money are the hardest workers. That's essentially the heart of meritocracy, right? Is that you work hard and you have skill, you're going to do well. Problem is that we know that that's not true, right? There are many people who are working really hard and are incredibly bright but didn't have access to resources, or weren't in an opportunity to be able to exemplify that, or didn't know the right people. So this idea from a functionalist perspective is that meritocracy is kind of the guiding principle. So we just all need to work really hard. A documentary called Erase the Power of an Illusion. They talk about the idea of pulling yourself up from the bootstraps. If you've never heard that phrase, it's the idea that, like, you just work hard and you can pull yourself up and out of anything. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be working hard and working for the good of our community or working to better ourselves. It's not what I'm saying. But in the documentary, the person was saying that how can you pull yourself up from the bootstraps if you were never given boots? Some people are given boots straight from the get-go, and others they're taken away or were never given them. So thinking about that, the idea of meritocracy, we do look a lot at the myth of meritocracy because who defines what hard work is and what skill is very dependent upon those in positions of power. Okay, conflict theory is another one. Structural functionalism and conflict theory are macro level theories. So conflict theory is basically the idea that society is in a constant state of conflict. It's essentially our organization in relation to conflict and how conflict is built into society. Over the years, over the last several, like over the decades, there's kind of two schools of thought. Two schools of thought. One, that conflict is just naturally embedded in our society, and then the other that we are essentially socialized into conflict and that we can break out of it. Regardless, though, conflict theory is looking at the power struggle over resources. So who benefits, who loses, the haves and have-nots, who has designed it that way. They also look at struggle and resistance. So who is maintaining most of the wealth, who's maintaining most of the power, and to what detriment of what people, and then also explains why there may be some level of resistance. Karl Marx, his ideas really are a lot of the foundation for this theory. Now, with that, I want to note that some people have heard a lot of really bad things about Marx or Marxism or Karl Marx. Marx just wanted to write literature, actually, but he saw so much exploitation going on that he didn't feel like he could do that yet. And then the poor guy ended up dying before he had a chance to. And the reason is that he saw the level of exploitation going on at the time of those in the working class or the proletariats by the capitalists and the bourgeoisie. Because if you think about kind of the pathway and trajectory over time, you consider that those in positions of power who have maintained power and been able to transfer that generational generation, right, are going to continue exploiting those who are not in positions of power or have what he calls the means of production. Basically, those who have all the raw materials and the equipment will continue exploiting the labor of the working class. Um, some people might say, oh, well, that's just natural, or you can work hard, right? But the idea, if we think about the inequities that have been historically and factually in place at this point, right, that becomes a huge problem because that is not always a matter of just simply working hard, but a matter of it being passed down and hoarding spaces and wealth. Within conflict theory, there's a lot of other theories, and I'm not going to go into super duper detail with these. Weber's another one. He looks at the connection between Protestantism or that Protestant work ethic and capitalism because of like the idea of hoarding wealth. So, God's favoring of people based off of how much they hoarded kind of helps contribute to capitalism. Capitalism is an economic structure or system. You will hear that a lot of sociologists will critique capitalism. My stance on that is that we have yet to see an economic structure that actually is of the people, for the people, by the people. And just because we are against one particular economic structure does not mean we automatically subscribe to something else, especially in the practice that we've seen it in this in our social world. A lot of conflict theorists are looking at critical theory. So Adorno is another one who looks at culture specifically, and how a lot of times there's this disparity or discrepancy between cultural values and norms and who is deciding on what's valuable. Feminism, critical race theory, the critical disabilities theory, lack crit theories. Those are all also they're not conflict theory themselves, but they are kind of nested in the same category. And then we have, sorry, then we have, and then we also have, symbolic interactionism. So symbolic interactionism is essentially the meanings that we create. So one of the things I always talk about is how the middle finger does not inherently mean F you, right? We don't come out of the womb automatically knowing that that means F you and has some sort of negative derogatory meaning to it. The idea with symbolic interactionism is that we've attached meanings to things and we've created these meanings through both our collective and individual experiences. There's no biological basis to the meanings that we've created. Otherwise, it becomes what's called biological essentialism. So that does not mean that we do not have some sort of biological basis for who we are, but rather not every single person of the same race is going to behave the same. Not every person of the same sex or gender or anything else that's created is going to be the same. And yes, I did say things that are created because the idea of sex being a binary of male and female is also a social construct because there are 6 different karyotypes and there's intersex people that absolutely exist. And if we pretend like that's not the case, that ends up completely dismissing and diminishing any race and groups of people. That is why we look at that from the idea of meaning making and symbolic interactionism, because we understand that these contexts of what we understand, how we understand it, is dependent very heavily on what our society has said and what our society has done. So essentially, it's this idea of social construction and the meanings that we make. That also influences our interactions and how we create those meanings through those interactions, the shared meanings transmitting knowledge from one group to another group.